The wagon pulled away just after dawn. September 15th, 1887. The Wyoming high plains stretched empty in every direction. Grass the color of old brass, bending under a wind that never stopped. The Mitchell wagon, loaded with everything a broken family could carry, creaked east toward a future that promised warmth and wages and the forgiveness that comes with surrender. 17-year-old Willa Thornton stood beside the barn and did not wave. Her father, Robert Thornton, sat rigid on the driver's bench, eyes fixed on the horizon. A good man, a careful carpenter, a terrible farmer. 3 years he'd fought this land. 3 years the land had won. The drought had taken his corn. The winter had taken his cattle. The debt had taken everything else. Her mother, Catherine, wrapped in blankets despite the mild morning, coughed wetly into a handkerchief. The sound carried across the empty yard. Consumption, the doctor had said. She needed the East. She needed cities with hospitals and air that didn't scour the lungs. Caleb Thornton, Willa's older brother, 22 and hungry for steel mills and regular pay, held the reins to the second horse. He'd been the one to say it 3 nights ago, after their father had announced the decision to leave. "You'll be dead by Christmas, Willa. Not cruel, just certain. Or you'll come crawling to the station begging for a ticket. Either way, you're proving nothing." The wagon rolled over the first rise. Willa watched until it disappeared, a dark speck swallowed by distance and dust. The wind picked up. The barn door creaked on leather hinges. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She was alone. She turned and walked into the barn. The silence was complete. No voices, no arguments about next year's planting or the price of seed or whether they should try wheat instead of corn. Just the wind, constant and cold, whistling through gaps in the wood. The barn was 20 feet square. Solid timbers, tight joints. Her father's best work, built the first month they'd arrived back when hope was still a reasonable thing to feel. The loft held 30 bales of hay harvested from the creek bottom, where the grass grew thick. The walls were chinked with clay and straw. The roof was good shake, overlapped and sealed. It was the best structure on the property. Willa stood in the center of the space and did the calculations she'd been doing in her head for 6 months. 20 feet by 20 feet. 400 square feet. Low ceiling, maybe 9 feet at the peak. Call it 3,000 cubic feet of air to heat. The cabin, by comparison, was 30 by 40. 2 rooms. High ceilings. 6 windows that leaked heat like open wounds. Maybe 10,000 cubic feet. The math was simple. The cabin was a losing game. But the barn was possible. She walked to the northwest corner and knelt. The floorboards here were loose. Her father had meant to fix them, had never gotten around to it. She pried up 3 planks and reached into the dark space beneath. Her hand found the leather satchel. Inside was $12 in coins and small bills. Caleb had left it. She'd found it 2 days ago, along with a note written in his careful hand. "For the train ticket. When you're ready to admit I was right." She counted the money again. $12. Enough for passage to Cheyenne and a week's board while she looked for work. Enough to leave. She put the money back under the floorboards and replaced the planks. Then she walked to the corner where her father had stored his old trunk. It was heavy, iron-bound, scarred from years of travel. Robert Thornton had been a railroad man before he'd been a farmer. Assistant engineer on the transcontinental line back in the 1870s. He'd worked his way west, laying track through mountains and across deserts. Had learned to read elevation maps and calculate grades and understand the physics of moving weight across distance. He'd kept his books. Willa opened the trunk. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 17 volumes. Engineering manuals, thermodynamics, structural mechanics, mathematics of heat transfer, material science, books with diagrams of bridges and boilers and retaining walls, books with tables of thermal conductivity and specific heat capacity, and R values for different types of insulation. She'd been reading them for 3 years. At first, just curiosity. Her father would work late in the cabin studying these books by lamplight, trying to understand why his farming kept failing. Willa would sit beside him quiet, watching the diagrams, asking questions he was too tired to answer properly. So she taught herself. She read about conduction and convection and radiation. She learned that heat moves from hot to cold always relentlessly, and that the only way to slow it is to place barriers in its path. She learned that air, when trapped, and still is one of the best insulators that exists. She learned that mass absorbs heat and releases it slowly, smoothing out temperature swings. She learned that buildings, like machines, follow rules. And she'd been taking notes. Willa pulled out her own journal from the bottom of the trunk. 212 pages filled edge to edge with her small, precise handwriting. 3 years of observations. 3 years of data. Temperature readings taken every morning and evening inside the cabin, and outside and down in the storm cellar. Her father had dug into the hillside. Wind measurements estimated by watching grass bend and feeling the pressure on her face. Sketches of animal burrows. Badgers and foxes and prairie dogs. Creatures that lived underground and survived winters that killed cattle. Calculations, endless calculations. She opened to a page dated February 14th, 1886. The coldest week of that winter. Outside temperature minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Cabin interior 43 degrees. Stove burning, continuously consumption, approximately 12 pounds of wood per hour. Wind from northwest sustained 30 miles per hour. Storm cellar temperature 49 degrees. Stable. No fire. She flipped forward. March 3rd, 1886. Examine badger burrow, east pasture. Entrance faces southeast, shielded from prevailing wind. Tunnel depth approximately 4 feet. Temperature at terminus 46 degrees. Outside temperature 22 degrees. Differential 24 degrees. No heat source. Insulation is earth itself. She flipped forward again. August 12th, 1887. A month ago. Conclusion. Cabin design is fundamentally flawed. Volume too large for available fuel. Surface area to volume ratio unfavorable. 6 windows create thermal bridges. Log construction, though aesthetically sound, provides minimal insulation. Estimated R value 8. Insufficient for local climate. Alternative approach required. Beneath that, she'd drawn a diagram, a cross-section of the barn. The existing timber walls shown as thin black lines. Then 3 feet out from those walls, another line, thick, shaded, labeled earthen mass compacted sod, minimum 36 inches. Between the two lines a gap, 2 feet of empty space, labeled air cavity convection barrier. She'd calculated the thermal performance. The earth would provide mass. The air would provide resistance. Together, they would create an R value of approximately 40. The cabin had an R value of 8. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. But it required work. Brutal, relentless work. And it required belief in numbers that no one in this valley had ever tested. Willa closed the journal. She looked around the barn, empty now except for hay and a few tools in the small cast-iron stove her father had left behind. She could spend $12 on a train ticket, or she could spend 10 weeks building a wall. She stood and walked outside. The wind hit her immediately, cold and constant. It was mid-September. The first freeze would come in late November, maybe 6 weeks away. The hard cold, the killing cold would arrive in January. She had time. Barely. Willa walked to the equipment shed and found the sod cutter. It was a heavy iron plow, designed to slice horizontal ribbons of prairie grass and the matted root system beneath. Designed to be pulled by a team of oxen. She had no oxen. Her father had sold them in August. She stood looking at the implement for a long moment. Then she walked to the woodpile and selected the longest, straightest branch she could find. Ash 6 feet long, thick as her wrist. She carried it back to the cutter and studied the harness points. An hour later, she had a system. She drove an iron stake into the ground 50 feet from the barn. She attached a rope to the stake and ran it back to the sod cutter. Threading it through a pulley she'd salvaged from the well. The branch became a lever wedged against the cutter's frame. She positioned the blade at the starting point. Then she pulled. The cutter resisted. The earth held tight. She leaned her full weight into the lever feet, braced back straight, and felt the blade bite. 6 inches of progress. She walked to the stake wound, the rope tied on the pulley, locked it, walked back to the cutter, pulled again. 6 more inches. This would be her life for the next 10 weeks. She worked until the light failed. By sunset, she had cut a strip of sod 12 feet long. She used her father's old spade to section it into bricks. 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, 4 inches thick. She lifted the first brick. 50 pounds of earth and grass and roots, dense and heavy and smelling of soil. She carried it to the barn and set it on the ground exactly 3 feet from the north wall. Then she went back and got another. By dark, she'd moved 18 bricks. Her hands were raw. Her shoulders burned. She'd covered perhaps 6 linear feet of the wall she needed to build. She needed 2,000 more bricks. The numbers didn't lie. 10 weeks, 20 bricks per day. It was possible, just barely. Willa heated water over the stove and cleaned her hands. She ate cornbread and dried meat. She lit the lamp and opened her journal. September 15th, 1887. Family departed. Construction begins. First test of leverage system functional but inefficient. Output 18 bricks, 6 hours. Required daily output 22 bricks to complete north and west walls before freeze. Adjustment needed. She closed the journal. Outside, the wind howled against the barn walls. The timbers creaked. Cold air seeped through gaps in the chinking. This was the enemy. Not the wind itself, but what it did. Wind stripped heat directly from surfaces. A 30-mile-per-hour wind pulled warmth through a log wall 20 times faster than still air. The cabin had fought the wind by burning wood. 5 cords last winter hauled 10 miles from the creek burned by February. Willa wasn't going to fight the wind. She was going to hide from it. The next morning, she adjusted the system. She repositioned the stake, shortened the lever, changed the angle of the rope. By noon, she was cutting faster. By evening, she produced 24 bricks. The day after that, 27. Her body adapted. Her hands toughened. She learned which patches of ground cut easiest where the grass grew thickest and the roots formed the densest mat. She learned to read the soil by color, to avoid sandy patches that crumbled to seek the dark loam that held together like fabric. She called these bricks prairie marble. By the end of week 1, she had 300 bricks stacked beside the barn. She began laying the foundation course. She dug a trench 8 inches deep, running parallel to the north wall. She lined it with gravel for drainage. Then she began laying bricks grass. Side down, joints staggered like a mason would stagger stone. The wall began to rise. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as it climbed. Every third course she laid bricks perpendicular, tying the outer face to the inner, creating a monolithic structure that would hold its own weight. The physics was woven into every motion. Each brick weighed 50 pounds. 50 pounds of thermal mass. The thick earthen wall wouldn't just insulate. It would store heat during the day, however much the weak winter sun could provide. Then at night, as the temperature plummeted, the wall would radiate that stored heat back inward slowly, steadily. The effect would be a massive dampening of the brutal temperature swings that defined Wyoming winters. And the air gap, the critical 2 feet of trapped air between the sod wall and the barn's timber wall. Still air. Dead air. Air that the wind couldn't touch, couldn't move, couldn't use to strip heat away. The wind's primary weapon was convection, moving air in contact with a warm surface. The air gap made convection impossible. The wind could batter the outside of the sod wall. It could strip heat from the frozen earth, but it couldn't reach the barn itself. Willa worked alone. The hours were long, dawn to dusk 7 days a week. Her muscles screamed. Her back ached with a deep, bone-level pain that never fully went away. She didn't stop. On the morning of September 29th, 2 weeks into construction, she had a visitor. Marcus Brennan. He rode up just after sunrise, a tall man in his 50s with a face weathered by 40 years on the frontier. He owned the biggest ranch in the valley, 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, a ranch house with glass windows and a stone fireplace. He'd built half the cabins in the territory. He knew construction the way some men knew scripture. He dismounted and walked slowly around the barn, studying what Willa had built. The foundation was complete. The north wall stood 4 feet high, a thick, organic-looking mass of compressed earth. Willa kept working. She didn't acknowledge him. She lifted another brick, carried it to the wall, set it carefully in place. Marcus watched. Then he spoke. "Miss Thornton." His voice was gravel, not unkind but not warm. What in God's name are you doing? Willa straightened. She met his eyes. Her hands were filthy, caked with clay and grass stains. Her dress was torn at the hem. She looked like exactly what she was. A 17-year-old girl alone trying to survive. Improving the barn, she said. Her voice was flat, factual. Marcus walked closer. He examined the brickwork. He kicked at the base with his boot. Solid. Dense. He ran his hand along the surface. The texture was rough but uniform. You're piling wet earth against timber, he said. Not a question. A statement of fact. That wall will sweat all winter. Moisture will get into your main posts. By spring, you'll have rot. By next winter, the whole structure could come down on your head. He looked at her, waiting for her to understand the mistake. Willa pointed to the gap between the sod wall and the barn's timber frame. I left an airspace, 2 feet. The moisture won't cross it. Marcus snorted. An air gap for the rats to winter in. He shook his head. The gesture wasn't mocking. It was something worse. Pity. Girl, you're going to freeze in there. Or the roof is going to cave in from the weight of all this dirt. Sod is for houses where you have people and fire to keep things dry. It's not for wrapping around a barn. He paused. His voice softened slightly. My wife could use help in the kitchen. Mrs. Brennan. She's getting on in years. You'd have a warm place to sleep. 3 meals. It's honest work. Willa didn't look at him. She bent and lifted another brick. I'm fine here, Mr. Brennan. Marcus sighed. He climbed back on his horse. Suit yourself. But don't come to me when your walls start to weep. He rode away. Willa watched him go. Then she set the brick in place and reached for another. The nickname started that week. She rode to the trading post on October 3rd. She needed salt and kerosene. The post was a rough plank building at the crossroads 10 miles east. A gathering place. News and gossip flowed through it like water. As Willa tied her horse, she heard a loud voice from the porch. Jake Porter, freight driver. Big man with a bigger mouth and a streak of cruelty that came out when he had an audience. Well, look what crawled out of the dirt. He was addressing the men on the porch, 4 or 5 of them leaning against the rail smoking. It's the Thornton girl. I hear she's building herself a tomb out there. Getting a head start. Digging her own grave to save the undertaker the trouble. Laughter. Not mean exactly, but not kind. Willa kept her head down. She walked into the post, bought her supplies, didn't meet anyone's eyes. The clerk, an older man named Hastings, was polite but distant. He wrapped her items in brown paper and took her coins without comment. She left. Jake was still on the porch. You need help hauling all that dirt, tomb builder? I got a wagon. Could bury you proper. More laughter. Willa untied her horse and rode away. Her face burned. Her throat was tight. She didn't look back. The nickname stuck. The tomb builder. It spread through the valley. Neighbors would ride past on the county road slow. Their horses stare at the strange earthen mound rising against the barn. They'd point. Talk amongst themselves. Her isolation was complete. On October 12th, she had another visitor, Mr. Whitmore from the county land office. He arrived in a small buggy wearing a wool suit and carrying a leather satchel. Official business. He walked the perimeter of the structure, making notes in a small ledger. He measured the wall thickness with a folding ruler. He examined the roof, checking for signs of stress. "Miss Thornton," he said, his tone professional but laced with concern. "I have to be honest. I've been assessing frontier structures for a decade. This isn't in any manual I've seen." He tapped his pencil against his ledger. "The sheer weight of this earth on unbraced walls is a significant structural risk. The county cannot be held liable for any incidents." Willa was mixing clay and water, chinking gaps in the sod. "The walls are braced by the barn itself," she said quietly. "The weight is compressive. It holds itself up." Whitmore peered at her over his spectacles. "Are you an engineer, Miss?" Willa looked at him. Mud on her hands, dirt under her nails. 17 years old. "I'm a survivor, sir." Whitmore made another note. His face was sympathetic but firm. "I'll have to file a report noting the unconventional and potentially hazardous nature of this structure. For the record." He climbed back into his buggy and left. Willa went back to work. The days grew shorter. The temperature began to drop. October gave way to November. The first light snow fell on November 8th. Just a dusting melting by noon. But a warning. Willa worked faster. Her daily output climbed. 30 bricks, 35. She was running the system like a machine now. Cut, section, hole, lay. Cut, section, hole, lay. Her hands moved without conscious thought. The north wall reached full height. 10 feet. 3 feet thick. A fortress of earth. She started on the west wall. The wind came from the west and north. Those were the directions that mattered. The south and east could stay open. She'd partition off a small corner inside the barn, 10 feet by 10 feet, just big enough for a bed and a stove and a table. Heating the entire barn would be impossible. Heating 100 square feet was manageable. By November 18th, both walls were nearly complete. The structure looked strange, organic, like the barn was being slowly absorbed back into the landscape. The lines were rough, not the clean geometry of timber and plank. It looked ancient, primitive. It looked like a burial mound. Willa stood back one evening exhausted and let herself see it the way others saw it. Ridiculous. Desperate. The work of a girl who'd lost her mind to loneliness. She heard Caleb's voice in her head. "You're making a fool of yourself." She pushed the thought away. She opened her journal. She reviewed her calculations. The numbers didn't care what it looked like. The numbers didn't care about mockery. The numbers said this would work. On the night of November 21st, she woke to a sound outside the barn. Footsteps. Quiet. Deliberate. She lay still, listening. Her heart hammered. The moon was 3/4 full. Pale light leaked through gaps in the walls. She heard voices. Low. Male. She crept to a knothole in the timber wall and looked out. 2 men. One was Jake Porter, unmistakable even in shadow. The other was younger, thinner. Someone from town she didn't recognize. They were at her woodpile. They were loading wood onto a small cart. Not all of it, just enough to hurt, enough to matter. Jake's voice carried on the still air. She won't need it anyway. Probably dead by February, frozen solid in her little tomb. The other man laughed nervously. What if someone sees? Who's gonna see girl's got no friends, no family? County doesn't care. We're doing her a favor, really. One less thing to burn when the structure collapses. They worked quickly. 5 minutes, maybe a quarter cord of wood, enough to last a week in deep winter. Then they left, pulling the cart away into the darkness. Willa stood motionless. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from anger, from the sheer injustice of it. She could report it, ride to town, tell the sheriff. But who would believe her, the crazy Thornton girl? The tomb builder accusing respected men of theft. She walked to the woodpile in the morning. The gap was obvious. She counted what remained. She did the math. She had enough fuel. Barely. If her calculations were correct, if the wall performed as designed, she had enough. But there was no margin for error now. She went back to work. November 24th. The temperature dropped hard. Morning frost that didn't melt. Ice in the water bucket. The west wall was 90% complete. Just the top courses left. Willa worked through the day without stopping. Her breath came in clouds. Her fingers were numb. By evening, she laid the last brick. The structure was finished. She stood back and looked at it. The north and west faces of the barn were encased in earth. 3 feet of solid, compressed school sod. The surface was rough, already hardening in the cold. It looked like a natural feature of the landscape, like the barn had grown out of the ground itself. The total cost in cash, $0. The cost in labor, everything she had. Willa walked inside. She'd already partitioned off her corner. 10 feet by 10 feet. Walls made of canvas and old blankets hung from the rafters. Not pretty, but functional. The small cast iron stove sat in the center. A stovepipe ran up through the roof. Beside the stove, a wooden crate that served as a table. A bedroll on the floor. A lamp. Her journal. Her father's engineering books. She had moved her provisions in. 50 pounds of flour. Dried meat. Root vegetables from the garden. Salt. Coffee. And wood. The woodpile inside, now protected, accounted for. She built a small fire. 4 logs. The stove heated quickly. She put a pot of water on to boil. Then she walked outside and looked at the thermometer she'd hung on the barn's exterior wall. 22 degrees Fahrenheit. She went back inside. Waited an hour. Let the fire settle to coals. She checked the thermometer she'd hung inside her partition space. 54 degrees. A 32-degree differential. With 4 logs. In the cabin, her family had burned 12 pounds of wood per hour to maintain 43 degrees when it was 18 degrees outside. She was burning maybe 8 pounds total and getting 54 degrees at 22 degrees outside. The math was working. Willa sat on her bedroll. She allowed herself one moment of quiet satisfaction. Not triumph. Not yet. But confirmation. The wall was doing what walls made of earth and air were supposed to do. Outside, the wind picked up. She heard it hit the sod wall with a low, dull sound. Solid. immovable. Inside, the air was still, warming. She opened her journal and wrote, November 24th, 1887. Construction complete. First thermal test, exterior 22 degrees, interior 54 degrees, fuel consumption minimal. Air gap performing as calculated. No moisture detected on timber walls. Structure stable. Initial results exceed projections. She closed the journal. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall. Light flakes drifting down through the darkness. Willa banked the fire. She lay down. Sleep came quickly. 3 miles away, Marcus Brennan stood in his ranch house feeding split oak into a fireplace that roared like a forge. The house was 46 degrees. His wife Ruth sat wrapped in blankets, shivering. Outside, the thermometer read 19 degrees. Marcus looked out the window toward the dark shape of the Thornton place invisible in the distance. "She won't last a month," he said to the fire. The fire crackled. The wind howled. The temperature kept dropping. December arrived cold and stayed cold. December came in cold and stayed cold. The first week brought temperatures that made the old-timers shake their heads. Single digits at night. Teens during the day. The kind of cold that made breath freeze in beards that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. Willa kept records. Every morning at 6. Every evening at 6. 2 measurements 12 hours apart. Outside temperature, inside temperature. Fuel consumption. The journal entries were precise. December 1st. Outside 8 degrees. Inside 52 degrees. Wood burned 6 pounds 4 logs of split cottonwood. Wind from northwest sustained 20 miles per hour. December 2nd. Outside 4 degrees. Inside 53 degrees. Wood burned 6 pounds. Wind from northwest sustained 25 miles per hour. December 3rd. Outside 2 degrees. Inside 54 degrees. Wood burned 7 pounds. Wind from north gusting to 30. The pattern held. As the outside temperature dropped, she added slightly more fuel. But the relationship wasn't linear. It wasn't desperate. She was burning perhaps 7 to 8 pounds of wood per day to maintain temperatures in the low 50s. She did the math in her head constantly. 7 pounds per day. Call it 50 pounds per week. 200 pounds per month. She had maybe 1,500 pounds of wood inside the barn. 3 months of fuel. Maybe 4 if she was careful. The winter would last 5 months. But she wasn't worried. Not yet. Because the wall was doing something she'd predicted but hadn't quite believed until now. It was storing heat. On sunny days, even weak winter sun, the exterior surface of the sod wall would warm slightly. The dark earth absorbed radiation. That heat would slowly migrate inward through the 3-foot mass, taking hours to penetrate. By evening, by night, the interior surface of the sod would be radiating that stored warmth back into the air gap. The barn wasn't just insulated. It was buffered. The thermal mass was smoothing out the temperature swings, creating stability that defied the chaos outside. On December 8th, she noticed something else. The interior temperature was rising, not from increased fuel. She was burning the same amount. But the temperature inside her small space had climbed to 56 degrees, then 57. She checked her notes, examined the structure. Then she understood. The earth wall was seasoning, drying out. As moisture left the sod, the thermal performance improved. Dry earth insulated better than wet earth, and the air gap, that critical 2 feet of dead space, was aging like wine. The air inside it was stratifying, layering, becoming progressively more still. By mid-December, she was maintaining 58 degrees, with the same fuel consumption she'd had at 52. The system was getting more efficient. She wrote it down, documented it, drew diagrams showing the heat flow patterns she believed were developing. She was alone in a barn in the middle of Wyoming in the coldest December in 20 years. And she was doing original research in thermodynamics. 3 miles west, the Brennan Ranch was burning wood like a locomotive. Marcus had 2 ranch hands that winter. Young men strong who'd signed on for wages and bunks and 3 meals. They were earning their keep. One of them spent 6 hours a day doing nothing but splitting and hauling firewood. The ranch house had a massive stone fireplace. It could hold logs 4 feet long. Marcus kept it roaring dawn to dusk. The heat was substantial, but the house was big. High ceilings, 3 rooms, windows on all sides. The temperature inside hovered around 46 degrees. Ruth Brennan wore 2 sweaters and a shawl at all times. She slept under 4 blankets. In the mornings, frost would coat the inside of the windows. The water in the wash basin would have a skin of ice. Marcus burned through half a cord of wood every 3 days, a full cord per week. He laid in 20 cords for the winter. Good cottonwood and ash cut the previous spring season dry. At this rate, he'd run out by March, and it was only December. Ruth brought it up on the evening of December 12th. They were eating dinner by the fire. Venison stew, bread, coffee. "Marcus," she said quietly, "we can't keep burning at this rate." Marcus chewed, swallowed, stared at the fire. "What would you have me do? Let us freeze? I'm just saying, if this winter runs long, if the cold holds into April like it did in '73, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Marcus had been ranching for 30 years. He knew the arithmetic. He'd done the calculation a dozen times already. They might not make it. 4 miles east, the Kinsley family was in worse shape. Eustace Kinsley was a homesteader like the Thorntons had been. A man of 45 with a wife Abigail and 3 children. The oldest was 12. The youngest was 3. Their cabin was smaller than the Brennan house, tighter, but also less well-built. Eustace had done most of the work himself, and he was a farmer, not a carpenter. The chinking was uneven. The roof leaked. The door fit poorly in its frame. Cold air came in through 100 invisible gaps. They were burning a cord and a half per week, mostly green wood unseasoned hauled from the creek. It produced more smoke than heat. The stovepipe was caking with creosote, narrowing, restricting flow. The cabin temperature stayed around 40 degrees. On December 9th, the youngest child, a girl named Emma, developed a cough, wet and deep. By December 12th, she had a fever. Abigail Kinsley held her daughter through the night, wrapped in every blanket they owned, listening to the child struggle for breath. There was a doctor in town, 10 miles, but the roads were already drifted. The cold was dangerous. Eustace stood by the door looking out at the darkness, doing the calculation. Risk the journey or wait it out? He waited. On December 15th, Willa rode into town for the first time since October. She needed salt. Maybe some coffee if the price was reasonable. The ride was bitter. The wind cut through her wool coat like it wasn't there. But she made it. The trading post was crowded. Men clustered around the stove, talking in low voices. The mood was tense. Willa kept to herself. She gathered her items and brought them to the counter. Hastings, the clerk, tallied them up. His expression was carefully neutral. As he wrapped her purchases, Jake Porter walked in. He saw her immediately. Well, well, the tomb builder lives. The men by the stove turned. A few smiled. Most just watched. Jake walked over, deliberately slow. He leaned against the counter. Heard you're still out there, all alone in your little dirt castle. He grinned. Must be getting mighty cold at night. Willa met his eyes, said nothing. Jake's grin widened. He was performing now, playing to the crowd. I'll tell you what, I got a bet going. $50 says you don't make it to February. $50 says you come crawling into town half frozen begging for help. He looked around the room. Several men nodded. One laughed. Marcus Brennan took the bet. He says you won't last till January. Man knows construction. He figures that pile of dirt you built is gonna collapse right on top of you. Jake leaned closer. His voice dropped, but not so low that others couldn't hear. So what do you say, tomb builder? You ready to quit now? Save everyone the trouble of digging you out come spring. Willa picked up her wrapped purchases. She looked at Jake Porter for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice quiet and absolutely level. Keep your money, Mr. Porter. You're going to need it. She walked out. Behind her there was silence, then laughter. Uncertain, nervous. Jake watched her go. His grin faded slightly. Something in her eyes had been unsettling. Not fear, not desperation, certainty. The ride back was long and cold. Willa's face burned, but not from the wind. The bet. $50. Her life wagered like a card game. She thought about stopping. Thought about the $12 still hidden under the floorboards. She rode past the turnoff to the train station and kept going home. That night she made a new entry in her journal. December 15th, outside -2 degrees, inside 58 degrees. Wood consumption 7 pounds. Public sentiment hostile. Financial wager placed on my death. Expected outcome survival. Calculated outcome validation. She underlined the last word twice. Christmas came and went. Willa spent it alone. She allowed herself a small indulgence. She cooked a proper meal. Biscuits, beans with salt pork, coffee with sugar. She sat at her small table and ate, slowly savoring warmth and quiet. Outside, the temperature was -8 degrees. Inside, it was 57. She thought about her family. Wondered where they were. Philadelphia, probably. Caleb working in a factory. Her mother seeing doctors. Her father looking for carpentry work. She wondered if they thought about her. If they assumed she was dead. She finished her meal, cleaned her plate, opened a book. The year turned. 1888 arrived without ceremony. January brought a shift. The cold intensified but differently. It became drier, sharper, the kind of cold that didn't just chill, it bit. January 1st. Outside minus 12 degrees. Inside 56 degrees. January 3rd. Outside minus 18 degrees. And inside 55 degrees. January 5th. Outside minus 25 degrees. Inside 54 degrees. The temperature inside was dropping. Not dramatically, but measurably. Willa increased her fuel consumption slightly, 8 pounds per day. 9. It held at 54 degrees. She reviewed her calculations. The wall was performing as designed, but there was a limit to what earth and air could do. At some point, the differential would become too great. The heat loss would exceed the insulation's capacity. She didn't know where that point was. The books didn't have data for this exact configuration. She was in uncharted territory. On January 7th, she woke to a different kind of silence. The wind had stopped. She sat up, listened. Nothing. No howl. No constant pressure against the walls. Just stillness. She dressed and went outside. The air was shockingly cold. So cold it hurt to breathe. Each inhalation felt like knives in her lungs. The thermometer read minus 30 degrees. The sky was clear, crystalline. Stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The Milky Way was a river of light overhead. She looked north. The horizon was dark, but there was something in the air, a quality of pressure, of waiting. She'd read about this in her father's notes, in old journals kept by railroad surveyors. Before the worst storms, there was often a calm, a pause, the atmosphere gathering itself. Willa went back inside. She checked her provisions, counted her wood. She had enough. If the storm came and lasted 3 days, she had enough. If it lasted longer than that, the math got complicated. January 8th. The calm held. Outside minus 32 degrees. Inside 52 degrees. She was burning 10 pounds of wood now. The interior temperature was still dropping, but slowly. January 9th. Outside minus 30 degrees. A slight warming. The wind returned but light. Variable. The sky remained clear. January 10th. The wind shifted. Southwest. Warm air, relatively speaking. The temperature climbed to minus 10 degrees by noon. Then to 0. Then incredibly to 10 above. Men emerged from their cabins blinking in the sunlight. Children played in snowdrifts. It felt like spring. It was a lie. The old-timers knew. This was the setup. The storm was coming from the northwest from Canada, pushing a wedge of warm air ahead of it. When the two systems collided, the result would be catastrophic. By evening, the sky had changed. The blue was fading, replaced by a sickly yellow-gray. The clouds were moving fast. Too fast. Willa brought in the last of her exterior woodpile. She'd been keeping some outside, covered by canvas. She dragged it all inside now. Stacked it against the wall. She filled every container with water. She checked the stovepipe. She made sure the barn door could be barred from inside. Then she waited. January 11th dawned clear and warm. 18 degrees, almost balmy. The wind had died completely. The silence was absolute. Willa stood outside at noon and looked north. The sky in that direction was the color of old bone. The clouds were low, moving, churning. She could see the storm now, a wall of white stretching across the entire horizon. It was still 50 miles away, maybe more. It would arrive tomorrow. She went inside. She laid out her supplies, food for a week, water, lamp oil, matches, wood carefully counted. She had fuel for 10 days if she burned 8 pounds per day, 2 weeks if she rationed to 6. She opened her journal and wrote, January 11th, 1888. Storm approaching. Expected arrival tomorrow morning. Exterior temperature currently 18 degrees. Interior stable at 54 degrees. Supplies adequate. Structure sound. Outcome survival. She closed the journal. Outside, the first flakes began to fall, lazy, drifting. By evening, the wind returned. She woke at 3 in the morning to a sound like freight trains. The blizzard had arrived. The wind hit the barn with a physical force. The timbers groaned. The entire structure vibrated. Snow drove horizontally so thick that looking outside was like looking into white static. The temperature was falling, fast. She lit the lamp, fed the stove, checked the thermometer. Outside minus 15 degrees. Inside 49 degrees. Dropping. The wind was pulling heat through the walls faster than the stove could replace it. Not through the sod. The sod was holding, but through the roof, through the door, through invisible gaps in the timber. Willa added more wood. The fire roared. The temperature inside stabilized at 48 degrees. She wrapped herself in blankets and sat at her table. Outside, the wind screamed. By noon, the thermometer outside read minus 28 degrees. The wind was sustained at 50 miles per hour. Gusts higher. Inside, the temperature was 46 degrees. She was burning 12 pounds of wood per day now, maybe more. She'd lost track. She recalculated. At this rate, her fuel would last 8 days. The storm showed no signs of stopping. This was January 12th, the children's blizzard, the schoolhouse blizzard, a storm that would kill more than 200 people across the Great Plains. A storm that would be remembered for 100 years. Willa didn't know any of that. She just knew it was cold and getting colder. By evening, the outside thermometer read minus 31 degrees. Inside, 44 degrees. She added wood. The stove was running hot now. The metal glowed dull red. But the heat was being sucked away. The wind was relentless. A vampire. A thief. She put on every piece of clothing she owned. 2 dresses, wool leggings, her father's old coat, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She sat by the stove and waited. January 13th. The wind never stopped. The sound was maddening. A howl that went on and on, rising and falling but never ceasing. The barn shook. Snow found its way through gaps she didn't know existed. Small drifts formed in corners. The temperature outside was minus 35 degrees, inside 42 degrees. She was burning wood constantly now, feeding the stove every hour. The pile was shrinking visibly. She did the math. 3 days of fuel left, maybe 4, if she let the temperature drop to freezing. The storm had been going for 36 hours. Historical records said these storms lasted 3 days, 4 at most. She could make it, probably. But there was no margin. None. That night alone in the dark, with the wind howling and the cold pressing in from all sides, Willa Thornton had her moment. Not panic, not despair, but calculation. She sat at her table with her journal open. She looked at her numbers: fuel consumption, temperature, days remaining. The math was close, too close. She could ration further. Let the temperature drop to 35 degrees. She'd survive. Barely. But if the storm lasted 5 days instead of 3, she'd run out of wood with days of cold still to come. She could burn the table, the chair, the floorboards. She looked at her father's engineering books, 17 volumes, thick, dry. They would burn for hours. Her hand touched the spine of the nearest book. Principles of Heat Transfer, Volume 2. This book had taught her everything. It had given her the knowledge to build the wall, to survive. Burning it would be a betrayal of her father, of herself, of the idea that knowledge could save you. But it would buy her 3 more days of heat. She sat there for a long time, hand on the book, staring at the stove. Then she stood. She walked to the woodpile. She counted the logs again, carefully this time. 62 logs. Call it 4 pounds each. 248 pounds of wood. At 12 pounds per day, that was 20 days. At 8 pounds per day, that was 31 days. The storm was on day 2. January was 31 days long. It was the 13th. 18 days left in the month. If she could get through the storm, if she could reduce consumption, after it passed, she could make it. The math held. Barely. But it held. She closed the journal. She added 1 log to the fire. Not 2. 1. The temperature inside dropped to 40 degrees. She wrapped herself in blankets and waited. Outside in the darkness, the storm raged. At the Brennan Ranch, Marcus was burning a cord every 2 days. The house was down to 38 degrees. Ruth was in bed, fully clothed, shivering under piles of blankets. One of the ranch hands had gone outside to check on the livestock. He'd gotten turned around in the whiteout. He'd made it back to the barn, but not before getting severe frostbite on both feet. The man sat by the fire crying quietly, watching his toes turn black. At the Kinsley cabin, the situation was worse. They'd run out of firewood on January 12th. Eustace had started burning furniture, chairs, the table, floorboards pried up from the corners. The cabin was 32 degrees. Emma, the youngest, was unconscious. Her fever had spiked to 105 degrees. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Abigail held her daughter and prayed. Eustace stood by the window, staring out at the white void, feeling the weight of his failures. By the morning of January 14th, Emma Kinsley was dead. They wrapped her small body in blankets and placed her in the corner of the cabin. The ground was frozen solid. They couldn't bury her. They'd have to wait for spring. Abigail didn't cry. She was beyond that. She just sat on the floor staring at nothing. Eustace went back to prying up floorboards. January 14th at Willa's barn. The storm showed signs of weakening. The wind was still strong, maybe 40 miles per hour, but no longer the sustained screaming force of the previous 2 days. The temperature outside was minus 38 degrees, the coldest it had been. Inside 39 degrees. Willa was burning 6 pounds of wood per day now, rationing hard. She'd let the fire go to coals, adding just enough fuel to keep it alive. She wore every piece of clothing. She moved as little as possible to conserve energy. She ate small amounts, drank water, stayed under blankets. She was cold, genuinely cold. Her fingers were numb. Her toes ached. But she was alive, and the storm was breaking. By evening, the wind had dropped to 20 miles per hour. The snow was lighter. Visibility improved from 0 feet to maybe 10. January 15th. Dawn came clear and brutally cold. The wind was down to 10 miles per hour. The sky was blue, crystalline. The sun rose over a landscape transformed. Snow had drifted to the eaves of buildings. Fences were buried. The roads were impassable. The temperature was minus 35 degrees. But the storm was over. Willa waited until noon to go outside. She needed to see, to confirm that it was real. She pushed open the barn door. It was heavy, blocked by drift. She had to force it, putting her shoulder into it. The door opened. Cold air hit her like a wall. She stepped outside. The world was white, utterly white. The barn was half buried. Snow had drifted against the north and west walls, some drifts reaching 8 feet high. The sod wall was completely covered. But the barn was standing. Willa walked around the perimeter. The structure was sound. The roof was solid. The sod wall, buried under tons of snow, showed no signs of stress. She checked the exterior thermometer, minus 35 degrees. Then she went back inside and checked the interior thermometer, 41 degrees. She'd survived. The worst storm in living memory. 3 days of winds over 50 miles per hour and temperatures below minus 30. And she'd done it burning less fuel than Marcus Brennan burned in half a day. She sat down at her table. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. The system had worked. Under conditions more extreme than anything she'd calculated for the wall had held. The air gap had functioned. The thermal mass had buffered the worst of it. She opened her journal. Her handwriting was shaky. January 15th, 1888. Storm concluded. Duration 72 hours. Minimum exterior temperature minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Minimum interior temperature 39 degrees. Total fuel consumption during storm 36 pounds. Structure performed beyond projections. Survival confirmed. She closed the journal. Outside, the sun was shining. The temperature was beginning to climb. It would reach minus 20 by evening. Warm, relatively speaking. She had fuel for another 3 weeks. The worst was over. Willa added wood to the stove. Not 6 pounds. 8. She let herself be warm. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to think about what came next. 3 miles away, Marcus Brennan stood in his yard, looking at the devastation. Cattle frozen where they'd huddled. Outbuildings collapsed under snow load. His fuel shed half empty. He'd burned through 8 cords in 3 days. He had 12 cords left for 6 more weeks of winter. The math wasn't good. He climbed on his horse. The animal was weak, underfed, but mobile. He rode slowly down the county road, checking on neighbors. The Kinsley place was silent. Smoke came from the chimney, but barely. Marcus knocked on the door. Eustace opened it. His face was gray, hollow. Marcus saw the small bundle in the corner. He understood immediately. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Eustace nodded, said nothing, closed the door. Marcus rode on. He passed 4 more homesteads. 2 were abandoned, the families fled. 1 showed signs of life. The last was questionable. Then he turned south toward the Thornton place. He didn't know why. Morbid curiosity, perhaps, or guilt. He'd bet $50 that she'd be dead. He expected to find the barn collapsed, the girl frozen inside. He crested the rise and saw the structure. It was standing, half buried in snow, but standing. And from the roof, a thin wisp of smoke rose into the clear air. Not the thick, desperate smoke of a fire being frantically fed. Just a small, lazy curl. The smoke of a fire that was adequate, controlled. Marcus stopped his horse. He stared. Then he saw movement. The barn door opened. Willa Thornton emerged. She was carrying a small bucket. She walked to where the snow had drifted against the north wall. She scooped snow into the bucket. Her movements were calm, unhurried. She was wearing a simple wool coat, unbuttoned. The temperature was minus 20 degrees. Marcus Brennan sat on his horse and felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't possible. It defied everything he knew about cold and heat and survival. But there she was, alive, moving with the easy confidence of someone who was warm, who had fuel, who had margin. He wanted to ride down, to ask, to understand. But pride held him back. He'd mocked her, bet against her, called her a fool. He turned his horse and rode home. But the image stayed with him. The girl in the unbuttoned coat, the thin wisp of smoke, the impossible warmth. Marcus Brennan didn't sleep well on the night of January 17th. He lay in bed fully clothed under 4 blankets, listening to Ruth's shallow breathing beside him. The house was 40 degrees. The fire in the main room had burned down to coals. One of the ranch hands would rise at 4 to rebuild it, to start the desperate daily cycle of wood and warmth. But Marcus couldn't stop seeing the image. The girl, the unbuttoned coat, the thin wisp of smoke, the impossible calm of it. He'd spent 40 years on this frontier. He'd built structures from the Dakotas to Colorado. He knew wood and stone and the bitter mathematics of heat loss. He knew what winter demanded and what it took. What he'd seen at the Thornton place violated everything he understood. By morning, he'd made a decision. He needed to know. January 18th brought a slight warming, -12 degrees, almost spring-like after the depths of the storm. The sky was clear, the sun brilliant on the endless white. Marcus spent the day working, checking cattle, assessing damage. 3 head lost to the storm, 2 outbuildings with collapsed roofs, fence lines buried under drifts that would take weeks to clear. His wood supply was critically low, 10 cords remaining. At current consumption, that was maybe 5 weeks. And February was always the coldest month. He did the math over and over, trying to find a way it worked out. It didn't. That evening, he sat with Ruth by the fire. She was mending clothes, her fingers clumsy with cold. "We might need to go to town," Marcus said quietly. "Stay at the hotel for the rest of winter." Ruth looked up. Her face was drawn, exhausted. "Can we afford that?" Marcus didn't answer. They both knew the answer. January 19th. Marcus rode the perimeter of his range. More dead cattle. The financial losses were mounting, but his mind wasn't on the money. He kept thinking about thermodynamics, about the simple physics of it. Heat flows from hot to cold, always. The rate of flow depends on insulation. The capacity to hold warmth depends on mass. He'd read books. Years ago, when he was young and ambitious, he'd studied construction the way some men studied scripture. But he'd never seen anyone wrap a building in earth. Why would you? Earth was heavy, difficult to work, prone to settling. It held moisture. Except Earth also had mass. Tremendous mass. And mass stored heat. And if you created an air gap, if you separated the Earth from the structure, you could prevent moisture transfer while maintaining thermal benefit. It was theoretically sound. He'd just never seen it done. Until now. January 20th dawned cold and clear, -18 degrees. Marcus loaded a quarter cord of firewood onto a sledge. Good ash, well seasoned. He told Ruth he was checking on the Mitchell girl. A charitable visit. Ruth didn't question it. Charity was expected, even for the foolish. He rode slowly. The journey took an hour, the horse struggling through drifts. When he crested the final rise and saw the barn, he stopped. The structure looked like something from another age. The north and west walls were encased in snow-covered earth. The lines were organic curved. It didn't look built. It looked grown. But it was standing, solid. The roof was clear. Snow had slid off the steep pitch. And from the stovepipe, that same thin wisp of smoke. Marcus rode down. He dismounted 20 feet from the door. He stood for a moment, gathering himself. Then he walked forward and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Willa Thornton looked at him with steady eyes. No surprise, no fear. Just calm attention. "Mr. Brennan." Her voice was level. She wore a simple dress. Wool, but not heavy. A shawl over her shoulders. Her face was neither pale nor flushed. Healthy, rested. Behind her, Marcus could see into the small partitioned space. The stove glowed softly. A kettle sat on top, steaming gently. A book lay open on the small table. The lamp was lit even in daylight. It looked like a room in autumn, not the heart of the worst winter in living memory. "Miss Thornton," Marcus said. His voice came out rougher than intended. "I brought wood. Thought you might be running low." Willa glanced at the sledge. A quarter cord of prime ash, enough to heat his ranch house for 2 days. "That's kind of you," she said, "but I have enough." Marcus looked past her at the small woodpile visible in the corner. Maybe 60 logs. He did the quick calculation. At normal consumption rates, that was 3 days of fuel. 4 at most. "That won't last long," he said. "It'll last until March," Willa replied. Marcus stared at her. March was 6 weeks away. The math didn't work. Couldn't work. Unless... "May I come in?" he asked. Willa stepped back. "Of course." Marcus entered. The warmth hit him immediately. Not a blast, not the dry, fierce heat of an overworked stove. Just gentle, steady warmth. He'd brought a calibrated thermometer, a professional surveyor's instrument accurate to within 1 degree. He'd carried it in his coat to keep it from freezing. "Do you mind if I take a reading?" he asked, pulling it out. "Go ahead." Marcus hung the thermometer from a nail on one of the timber posts. Then he waited. 3 minutes. Standard protocol for accurate measurement. While he waited, he looked around. The space was perhaps 10 feet square. Simple. Almost Spartan. But organized. Clean. Everything had a place. He examined the walls. The interior surface of the barn's original timber construction was visible. He touched it. Cool, but not cold. Not even close to cold. No frost. No moisture. Bone dry. His objection, the one he'd thrown at her 2 months ago, had been wrong. The air gap was working. The vapor barrier was holding. He looked at the thermometer. The mercury had settled. 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Marcus stared at the number. He picked up the thermometer, examined it in the lamplight. The reading was clear, unambiguous. He pulled out his pocket watch, checked the time, then walked to the door, opened it. The cold air rushed in. He stepped outside and checked the exterior thermometer Willa had mounted to the barn wall. Minus 18 degrees. He went back inside, closed the door, looked at the interior thermometer again. 57 degrees. The differential was 75 degrees. He turned to Willa. She was sitting at her table watching him with quiet attention. "How much wood are you burning?" His voice was hoarse. "About 5 pounds a day now," she said. "It was higher during the storm, 8 or 9 pounds, but the system has stabilized." Marcus did the math in his head. 5 pounds per day, 35 pounds per week, 140 pounds per month. He was burning 2,000 pounds per month. She was using less than 1/10 of his fuel. And her interior temperature was 11 degrees warmer than his. He walked to the wall, separating the sod from the barn's original timber. He touched it, examined the construction. The 2-foot air gap was evident. The sod wall beyond was invisible, buried in snow and earth. But he could see the principle. Dead air. Thermal mass. Vapor separation. It was elegant. Simple. And it worked. "May I examine the exterior?" he asked. Of course. They went outside together. Marcus walked around the structure, studying it with professional eyes. The sod was compacted dense. The courses were even properly staggered. The construction was crude by aesthetic standards, but structurally sound. He cleared snow from a section of the north wall. The sod was frozen solid, hard as stone. He knocked on it with his knuckles. The sound was dull, absorbed. "This is 3 feet thick?" he asked. 36 inches, Willa confirmed. "And the air gap is 2 feet 24 inches. Marcus straightened. He looked at the barn, then at the girl standing beside him in her unbuttoned coat. He felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. The humility of encountering something genuinely new. Something that worked better than anything he'd ever seen. They went back inside. Marcus sat at the small table without being invited. Willa put the kettle on for coffee. "How did you know this would work?" he asked finally. Willa was quiet for a moment. Then she walked to the corner and picked up her journal. She set it on the table in front of him. "I calculated it," she said simply. Marcus opened the journal. The first page was dated 3 years ago. The handwriting was small, precise, meticulous. He began to read. Temperature logs, wind measurements, observations of animal behavior, sketches of burrows and root cellars. And then, as the pages progressed, something else. Calculations, thermal conductivity values for different materials, R-value estimates, heat loss equations, diagrams showing convection patterns, radiation transfer, conduction rates. This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't intuition. This was engineering. Marcus looked up at Willa. "Where did you learn this?" "My father's books," she said. She gestured to the small shelf. 17 volumes. Professional engineering manuals. "I taught myself." Marcus closed the journal carefully. He sat back in his chair. The coffee was ready. Willa poured 2 cups and sat down across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Marcus said, "I called you crazy." Willa sipped her coffee, said nothing. "I told everyone you were building a tomb. I said you'd be dead by Christmas." He paused. The words were hard to say. "I bet $50 that you wouldn't survive to January." Willa met his eyes. Her expression didn't change. "Did you win or lose?" she asked. "I lost," Marcus said. "I lost the bet. But I won something else." "What's that?" "I learned that I'm a fool, and that you're not." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. Inside, the stove crackled softly. "I was wrong," Marcus said. Each word was deliberate. About everything. The moisture, the structural risk, the whole concept. He gestured at the space around them. "This is the most thermally efficient structure I've ever seen, and I've been building for 40 years. Willa nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." "I want to understand it," Marcus said. "The principle, the mathematics. Because my family is suffering. The Kinsleys lost their youngest daughter. The whole valley is barely surviving. And you're sitting here reading books in 57-degree warmth." He leaned forward. "Will you teach me?" Willa looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the mockery, the public humiliation, the bet. She thought about Caleb's words. You're making a fool of yourself. She thought about the choice between bitterness and grace. Yes, she said, but spring is better for building. The ground needs to thaw. Marcus nodded. When this winter breaks, I'll help you. Publicly. I'll tell everyone I was wrong. I'll help the Kinsleys rebuild. Anyone who wants to learn this method. Why? Willa asked. Marcus looked into his coffee. Because you were right. And because people are dying. And because I'd rather be a fool who learned than an expert who killed his neighbors through ignorance. They talked for another hour. Marcus asked questions. Willa explained the principles. She showed him her calculations, her diagrams. She walked him through the logic of thermal mass and air gaps and convection barriers. Marcus listened like a student, taking mental notes, asking for clarification, beginning to understand. When he finally left, the sun was low in the sky. He climbed on his horse and looked back at the barn. It didn't look primitive anymore. It looked revolutionary. He rode home through the gathering dusk, his mind racing with possibilities. February arrived cold, but without the savage intensity of January. The temperatures stayed in the single digits, manageable. On February 1st, a county buggy arrived at Willa's barn. Mr. Whitmore from the land office, accompanied by a surveyor named Thompson. Whitmore had come in October to express concerns. He was back now to document reality. Miss Thornton, he said formally, I'm here to conduct an official assessment, with your permission. Of course, Willa said. They spent 3 days. Whitmore and Thompson measured everything. Wall thickness, air gap dimensions, thermal performance. They brought calibrated instruments. They took readings at different times of day, different weather conditions. Exterior temperature average -6 degrees. Interior temperature average 56 degrees. Fuel consumption documented at 6 pounds per day. Thompson, the surveyor, was a quiet man who rarely spoke. But on the 3rd day, as they were packing their instruments, he said, I've surveyed 400 structures in this territory. This is the most efficient one I've ever measured. By a factor of 10. Whitmore wrote his report carefully. He included Willa's calculations. He credited her by name. He noted her age and circumstances. The report was titled, Thermal Performance Assessment, Earth Bermed Shelter Construction, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. It was technical, data-heavy, dry, and it was devastating in its implications. Everything the frontier had been doing for 70 years was inefficient, wasteful, dangerous. A 17-year-old girl with no formal training had solved a problem that had killed hundreds. The report was filed with the Territorial Agricultural Office on February 15th. Copies were made, distributed. By March, it had reached Montana, Dakota Territory, Nebraska. By April, engineers were requesting additional information. The winter began to break in late February. The temperature climbed above freezing during the day. The snow started to melt slowly at first, then in a rush. The valley began to count its dead, 7 people in total. Emma Kinsley was the youngest. An old man named Horvath who lived alone was found frozen in his cabin. 5 others scattered across the territory. It could have been worse, much worse, but it was bad enough. Marcus Brennan came to Willa on the first day of March. "The Kinsleys want to build," he said. "I'm going to help them, but I need you to advise." They rode to the Kinsley homestead together. Eustace was there, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Abigail sat on the porch staring at nothing. Marcus explained the principle. Willa showed them her diagrams. They proposed a simpler version, just the north wall, 2 feet thick instead of 3, enough to make a difference. Eustace listened. When they finished, he said, "Will it work?" Willa nodded. "Yes." "Will it keep my family warm?" "Yes." Eustace looked at his wife. Abigail met his eyes. Something passed between them. Not hope exactly, but determination. "We'll do it," Eustace said. They started in mid-March. Marcus brought 2 ranch hands to help. Willa came every few days to check progress, to answer questions, to solve problems. The work went faster with 4 people. The sod was soft, easy to cut. They completed the north wall in 3 weeks. By the time they finished, 6 other families had come to watch, to ask questions, to understand. Marcus stood on the Kinsley porch and spoke to the small crowd. "I mocked this girl," he said, gesturing to Willa. "I called her crazy. I bet money she'd be dead. I was wrong about all of it." He paused. "She's smarter than every builder in this valley, including me. And if you want to survive next winter, you'll listen to what she has to say." It was the most public apology Marcus Brennan had ever made. The adoption spread like fire. By summer, 7 families had started projects. Some did full enclosures like Willa's. Others did partial walls, just the north and west faces. The complexity varied, but the principle was consistent: earth, air, thermal mass. Willa consulted on each one. She was compensated sometimes, paid in goods or labor or occasionally cash. But mostly she helped because helping meant survival. For everyone. Marcus retrofitted his own ranch house in June. He didn't do a full enclosure. Too expensive, too much disruption. But he added earth berms to the north and west walls. 2 feet of compacted soil sloped against the foundation. The work took 2 weeks. Cost almost nothing except labor. The next winter, his fuel consumption dropped by 60%. The interior temperature climbed to 58 degrees. Ruth Brennan cried when she saw the thermometer reading. By fall of 1888, 19 families in the valley had adopted some version of the method. The trading post stopped calling it Thornton's Folly. They started calling them Mitchell Walls. No, Thornton Walls. The winter of 1888 to 89 was milder than the previous year, but it was still Wyoming, still brutal. The difference was measurable. 0 cold-related deaths in the valley. 0. Fuel consumption was down across the board. Families who'd burned 2 cords per month were now burning half a cord. The economic impact was substantial. Money not spent on firewood went to livestock equipment seeds. The valley, which had been dying, began to stabilize, and people remembered who'd started it. In 1889, the Territorial Agricultural Extension published a bulletin, "Low-Cost Methods for Winter Shelter Fortification," the Thornton method of earth-bermed construction. It was distributed to every county in the territory. Copies went to Montana, Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado. By 1890, more than 200 structures across the Great Plains used some variation of the technique. The bulletin cited Willa by name. It noted that she designed and implemented the system at age 17 alone with no formal engineering training. She became briefly famous. A journalist from Cheyenne came to interview her. A photographer took her picture standing in front of the barn. Willa hated the attention. She answered questions politely but briefly. She didn't elaborate. She didn't dramatize. When asked how she'd survive, she said, "I paid attention. I did the math. The earth is warmer than the wind. It's not new. It's just correct." The journalist wanted more. A story of triumph, of defiance. Willa gave him data. The article ran anyway. It was good. It was accurate. It spread. By 1891, agricultural colleges were teaching the principle. By 1895, engineering journals were citing it. By 1900, it was standard practice in cold climates. The innovation was absorbed into the background, the way good ideas often are. Most people forgot where it came from, but some remembered. In December of 1888, a letter arrived for Willa from Philadelphia. The handwriting was Caleb's. "Sarah, I heard stories. A journalist from Cheyenne wrote about the girl who defeated winter with dirt. They meant you. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Can I visit? Caleb." Willa wrote back, "Come for Christmas. I'll keep you warm." He came. On December 23rd, riding the train to Cheyenne and then a stage to the valley. When he walked into the barn, he stopped, felt the warmth, looked at the thermometer reading 58 degrees, looked at his sister. "You were right," he said quietly. "I doubted you. I shouldn't have." Willa hugged him. "You gave me $12. That helped. You gave yourself survival. That's all you." They spent Christmas together, warm, fed, safe. On December 26th, Caleb asked, "Are you angry at me, at Father, at everyone who left?" Willa thought about it. "No," she said finally. "You all did what made sense to you. I did what made sense to me. We're all still here. That's enough." Caleb stayed through January. He helped Marcus Brennan with a new project. He learned the technique. When he returned east, he took plans with him. By 1892, earth-bermed construction was being used in Pennsylvania coal country. The principle spread. The years passed. Willa lived in the barn for 5 more years. She consulted. She taught. She documented improvements. In 1893, she married a surveyor named William Chen. No, wait, not Chen. A surveyor named William Garrett. They built a house together, earth-bermed, efficient, warm. They had 3 children. She taught them all mathematics and physics. The barn stood. Willa kept it maintained. She wouldn't sell the property. By the 1920s, it had become something of a landmark. The original Thornton structure, preserved. By the 1970s, during the energy crisis, researchers rediscovered passive solar design. Earth sheltering, thermal mass. They found Willa's original documentation in the Wyoming Historical Society archives. Her journal, her calculations. Whitmore's official report. One researcher and architect named Sarah Caldwell wrote, Willa Thornton anticipated R40 wall assemblies by 90 years. She understood thermal mass before the term existed. She was doing passive house design in 1887. The barn was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. In 2015, a passive house architect named Michael Torres visited the site. He brought thermal imaging equipment. The barn was still standing, still owned by the Thornton family descendants, still maintained. Torres took readings. The structure, even unpowered, maintained a temperature differential of 15 to 20 degrees from ambient. After 127 years, he stood in the space where Willa had lived, where she'd survived the winter of 1888, where she'd proven that observation and calculation could overcome tradition and assumption. He opened his laptop and pulled up Willa's original journal, scanned and digitized. The handwriting was small and precise. The calculations were correct. The earth is warmer than the wind, she'd written. It's not new. It's just correct. Torres closed the laptop. He looked around the space. Then he took out his phone and called his office. I'm at the Thornton site, he said. We need to run new models. I think we've been underestimating thermal mass in our designs. In 2024, a documentary was made. The engineer's daughter, how a 17-year-old girl changed building science. It told the story. The family leaving, the wall, the storm, the validation. It interviewed descendants, engineers, historians. It showed the barn still standing. The documentary ended with a scene. A modern homesteader, a man in his 60s, sitting in his own earth-bermed home in Montana. Solar panels on the roof, thermal mass walls, R50 insulation. His home was warm, efficient, off-grid. He was reading Willa's journal, a printed copy available now as a book. She was 17, he said to the camera, alone, with nothing but books and determination. He paused, looking at the pages. She didn't complain. She calculated. She didn't hope. She engineered. He showed his own temperature log. Exterior minus 15 degrees. Interior 62 degrees. Fuel minimal. The physics hasn't changed, he said. Neither has human resilience. He set the book down, looked at the camera. When people ask me why I built this way, I tell them about Willa Thornton. I tell them that a teenage girl with no formal training solved a problem that killed hundreds. I tell them that knowledge and work and attention can beat anything. He smiled slightly. And I tell them that the earth is warmer than the wind. Always has been. Always will be. The camera pulled back, showed his home. Efficient, warm, sustainable. Built on principles proven in a barn in Wyoming in 1887. The documentary faded to black. But the story didn't end. Because every winter somewhere, someone builds a wall of earth, creates an air gap, trusts thermal mass over brute force, and stays warm. The principle endures. The math holds. And somewhere in the quantum uncertainty of history, a 17-year-old girl stands beside a barn holding a journal, looking at numbers that don't lie. She survived. She calculated. She proved it. The rest is physics.